and welcome everyone to tonight's program. I'm Rebecca Matalon, Curator at Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be joined this evening by artist Jessi Reaves. As Felice mentioned, this conversation is in coordination with the upcoming exhibition, Wildlife, Elizabeth Murray and Jessi Reaves, which opens at long last at CAMH next Thursday, February 18th. Wildlife brings together the paintings of the late Elizabeth Murray and the works of New York-based sculptor Jessi Reaves. Although the two artists are generations apart, the exhibition highlights their shared use of decorative, domestic, and bodily imagery. Works by Murray spanning the 1960s to the 2000s are presented alongside Reaves's sculptural assemblages of the last 7 years, which often take the form of functional furniture. You can see a really, sorry, one second. I'm going to read a brief bio for Jessi and then we'll get started. Jessi Reaves was born in Portland, Oregon and lives in New York. She received her BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2009. Over the last 7 years, Reaves' work has been exhibited extensively in both the United States and Europe, including recent presentations at the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Ridgefield, Connecticut, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, Philadelphia, and Sculpture Center in Long Island City, New York, among others. This spring, Reaves will be an artist in residence at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, and we are eagerly anticipating her return. So Jessi and I decided that tonight's talk would be a good opportunity to dig into her work in depth, and time permitting the exhibition as well. But there'll be many more opportunities for our audiences to gain insight into the exhibition, its themes, and both artists' work, so please stay tuned. And without further ado, welcome Jessi. Hey there. I think you're on mute.
Hi, thank you for your, oops, off to a good start.
All the time.
I know, I rarely have to Zoom, so I'm still bad at it. But yeah, thank you for your introduction. And I'm happy to get to talk to you and talk about the exhibition, which was, I don't know, so long in the making. Can't believe it's finally gonna open next week.
Very exciting. I know. All been waiting with bated breath, and an image of which everyone can see a panoramic view, which is absolutely absurd and wild, which my colleague Kristen Massa took. So we'll just keep this on the screen for a bit. I have a bunch of questions that we probably won't get through all of them, but I'm gonna start out, as I said, really digging into your work. But I'd like to begin with something you said in your recent interview with writer and musician Johanna Fateman, which will be published in the forthcoming catalog for the exhibition. To give a bit of context, again, you graduated from RISD in 2009, after which you largely stopped making art for several years. Speaking with Johanna, you note that, and I'm quoting you here, "When I got back into making art after taking that break, I was scared of making bad art and having to store it or look at it. I found it hard to justify making art for art's sake. That my sculptures had a functional potential propped them up somehow, but also felt perverse, as though that's the one thing I knew I really shouldn't do." You continue by noting that if it had failed at a sculpture, then it could succeed as a chair. I wanted to start here because I think it frames two key, though not unrelated, aspects of your work. One being your will towards transgression, the sort of doing what one knows one shouldn't do. The other being the sort of hybridity or indeterminacy of your work, the logic of both sculpture and furniture, rather than say either or to some extent. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this as sort of a framework for when you started making work, how transgression and hybridity play out in your work.
Yeah, I think, let's see. I mean, you sort of touch on this, but I guess, I graduated from art school, undergrad. I only have my undergraduate degree, and I graduated in 2009, so it was a bit of a, it was just it was a bleak moment. I really didn't see a lot of potential for making money off of my work. So I was doing um, a lot of different types of freelance jobs coming out of school. And there was, I mean, I think to kind of like react to your question, it was sort of, it wasn't like a transgressive lifestyle, but it was like a pretty scrappy moment for me. Like I was really, you know, that's kind of how I fell into doing upholstery, was kind of just trying to like piece together an income from all of these kind of different little freelance jobs. And, you know, eventually I started working with this one guy who was making furniture, and he gave me a studio. So that was the first studio that I had. And I think, you know, for better or worse, and like mostly for the worse, like I'm really somebody who has to have a studio. I'm kind of like thinking through making. So not having a studio, there was no place for me to really like accumulate materials and do all of these things that now, like looking back, I can see how important these things are to like my way of working. So when I started working with him, I don't know, there's like a little story I can tell that I think kind of like lends to what you're talking about. So he was working on these kind of very like elegant mid-century derivative pieces of furniture, and they were sort of like a checklist of things, of qualities of what he was making that was like what a luxury chair would be. Like they were made out of walnut, which is like a very hard, fancy wood, and they had like brass and gold hardware. They had leather upholstery. It was like, just check these boxes, and this is like a luxury object. And I mean, I learned a lot sort of like indirectly from working with him, because he would talk about what he was making in this kind of like really straightforward way. Like, it needs to look expensive. It needs to like look, as long as it looks like it will last forever. Like, this is what people want. And it was really through the experience of like working with him that I kind of led me to all these questions, which is kind of like the foundation for what I've been working on, which it's like, who makes furniture? Like, who is designed for? Like, what are the impulses of the kind of like obsessive collector character that kind of like populates this world? And of course, like, what is its interaction with art? And so we're working on this chair, and he had this very kind of cheap prototype version of it that was made out of like balsa wood and like aluminum. It was just a mock-up, and he had kind of thrown that in the trash outside of the studio when he was done with it. And I kind of pulled it out of the trash, brought it back into the studio, and started working on sort of my own version of his chair, which, you know, had exposed foam, and it sort of had this lace cover that was flipped inside out. And I don't know, I've definitely like told this story before, but it's true. Like, it was kind of like a messed up thing to do. Like, I was like working for this person on this thing for him. He was paying me, he was giving me a free studio, and I kind of like stole his design and made my own version. But in a lot of ways, it was sort of the basis of every, you know, it really just like empowered me to be like, well, if I can steal this thing and make it my own, I can take anything. I can take this Barcelona chair, I can take this other thing. Like, I can kind of like act out my sort of like disrespect for these things in whatever way, you know. It's obviously evolved over time, like from cutting things in half to, you know, just different sort of I don't know, just like acting onto them. And just I've always kind of liked the idea of like stealing and taking. But I think, you know, when I was a student, I was really focused on like artwork that felt original or had some sort of like original spin on it. And I don't know, yeah, it wasn't until I really like stole that chair from him that I kind of took that on and like made that a part of my practice.
I think that's a great entry into maybe the next slide. One thing we talked about doing during this talk again was to really, like this exhibition, survey the work you've made over the last 7 years, which I know has at times been hard for you, which as it often is for artists, to just sort of take stock of where they started and where they are now. And I remember when we were first sort of chatting and plotting out the exhibition, and when I first shared a checklist with you, you had very specific reactions or responses to my interest in including certain works, which is
Uh,
to say that you were clear about what you did not want to include, what you might be willing to consider, and what you would allow me to convince you to include. And so I think it would be good for us, maybe considering the sort of span of this exhibition, and it's really the first exhibition to look back at your work over the last 7 years, as I said, and to maybe sort of follow, as you're saying, this sort of origin point and like its returns and adaptations and the different way you're working with materials and the way that's evolved over time. So here we're looking at two works, two of your earliest works, right, from 2014.
mhm.
Um, the one on the left, Idol of the Hares, is currently in the CAM show, and on the right, Maraschino Ferry. And I wonder if you can talk about the kind of processes you're using in these specific works.
Yes. Um, I think that to say about these, it's always weird to look back at old work, but I think um, it's more that it like reminds me of what I was like trying to figure out at the time. I feel like I had kind of like a steep learning curve um, in terms of figuring out like what I was capable of making. I think we've talked about this before because Murray also talks about this in an interview, and it really rang true for me. But contact is just so important. Like I need to have contact with what I'm making, and so um, it's just been there's been such a steep learning curve with that. Like the chair on the left, Idol of the Hares. This is well, broadly like trying to make something that's really like sitting in this very awkward middle place between sculpture and furniture. Um, and that, yeah, the chair on the left, that's the first piece that I ever built entirely from scrap. I saw a chair by another artist that had like a cutout shape of an animal, and it was just very simple. It's like two profile pieces connected by a seat in the back, and I was just like, oh, if I can build a chair, it can be 4 pieces of wood. And like I was acquiring tools, so I just gotten a jigsaw, and you can kind of cut these shapes out. And my studio was near this Zarin Fabric, which is an old fabric store in the Lower East Side, and the upholstery people would save me the bags of scraps, which foam, was like a huge
Fabric?
material. What?
Scraps of both foam and fabric?
No, not fabric, just foam. Yeah, so in the basement there, they would cut foam um, for different commercial, or anyone could walk in there and buy foam, but they were mostly doing commercial stuff. And the foam was appealing to me as a material. It has, you go into the store and it kind of has these the dimensions of the piece of foam written on the side, and then when you go to, you never see the foam, so people draw directly onto the foam before they cut the shape out. And I liked the idea of those things being visible and those things becoming details in the work. And I mean, I have a lot I could say about what was interesting to me about foam at this point, but I think the real thing was like getting at this idea of blemish. Like what is the sort of like, what is it about a clean surface? Like what are we really trying to get at with that? And like, why do we have this kind of fear of the blemished surface? And foam just was the ultimate example of that. Like it absorbs every stain, every piece of hair sticks to it. Like it turns dark brown over time. It just like, it shows, it's a very, it literally shows its aging process.
It deteriorates. You can't clean it. It's
Yeah.
to that extent almost bodily, and it's just it deteriorates with age.
Yes.
Um, And it's
Um,
interesting because there's also, you're using, when you were talking about this, like at one point does something become a sort of art object in itself, and one point of it is design. Part of, I think, what throws that into question is the fact that you're using materials that are traditionally hidden from view,
right.
um, as the sort of surface. So there's a kind of like, am I supposed to touch this? Am I allowed to? That happens as well with the work.
Yeah, there's kind of like, I feel like with a lot of these, well, with these two works, there's kind of a little bit of like a paradox to the detail where it's like they're both crude and disgusting, but also like they have these sort of fabric slip covered elements which are quite delicate and more like clothing or like lingerie, um, which
I definitely serve to sort of anthropomorphize the objects, and the work on the right, Maraschino Ferry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a Joseph Hoffman chair, a sort of key modernist design chair that you've sort of put a slip cover on, or you've referred to it as like lingerie, sort of
Mhm.
dressing up this sort of object, which is reflexive of this sort of like very stark idea of design, pure lines or purity, like lines, an economy of form,
Mhm.
no ornamentation, and you've sort of like tarted it up a little bit.
Yeah, I think I always think with this, it's such a simple gesture. Like it's just kind of this very simple feminizing gesture. But I think in doing it, like the thing about this piece is it kind of like reframes the ontology of the chair itself, and like this idea of making slipcover. um I still work on things in this way, and I like the idea that it's just like is there to protect the chair, but then like switching the fabric, it makes the chair almost feel slightly more vulnerable. And the chair is, the slip cover is made in a pretty straightforward way. It's like the fabric's just pinned until it's almost so tight that you would never be able to get it off. And then I'll kind of cut the slip cover and add a zipper so that you can just kind of barely pop it off and on in order to be able to sew it, which that was like a thing we used to do. I don't know, maybe you did this, maybe not, but we would like do that with our pants when I was like in middle school. We would like use dental floss to like sew our pants really tight. And then
Wow.
you'd have to like snip the dental floss to be able to like make them loose enough to take them off again. And it's like sometimes I feel like I'm still kind of doing little things like that. Um,
That's interesting to think about the way that like you have engaged or thought through materials has sort of carried through to some extent. And again, this sort of like working with what one's got, like working with whether it's just the scraps that you have that are given to you for free, or the sort of faux modernist chair that you pull out of a dumpster. I think that's interesting, which maybe leads us to the next slide, um, which both of these works are included in our current exhibition, Muscle Chair Laying Down to Talk on the left from 2016, and Twice is Not Enough, Red to Green Chair from 2016 as well. And I think this is a phase in your work in which you start to um, find or come across, or someone gives you a piece of modernist furniture that's maybe falling apart, and then you start to take it apart. You're primarily working with found objects, and rather than, like, as you said, a sort of like simple additive gesture, like in Maraschino Ferry, in which you're putting the slipcover on it, um, you sort of break it into fragments, and then they get reincorporated or dispersed across multiple works.
mhm.
I love it when in your interview with Johanna you use the word cannibalize, which I really like. And I think these two works are a good example of it. With the leather on Muscle Chair coming from a Percival Lafer sofa, the exterior of it, the skin, and then you using the interior, the foam, across multiple works, such as Twice is Not Enough, which is on the right. And I love it, as you know, as you were saying before, that there's also kind of a refusal of wastefulness, to value and make use of every part of an object. As you said, you graduate in 2009 and are moved to New York, and you're just sort of piecing together work. And when you do start making it is with, and I've said this before, but like this sort of recession era mentality in which you're making as much use of materials as you can. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that aspect of your work.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean,
What interested you about that? What interested you about like finding an object and then splitting it up?
yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to just like get back into
Thinking
like
about old works.
yeah, no, just where, like, why exactly? I mean, what I think the circumstances in which I made these work, I went to a residency for 2 months to work on this show. And so before I left, I was kind of like gathering materials. I was really like, genuinely did not know what I was going to make. I just knew I had to do this show, and I was just gathering materials. And so, it is an intentionally like, it's intentionally like a resourceful way of making something. And I think I sort of have a fear about focusing too much on that, because there's kind of like this thing about like recycled art, and I especially grew up with that. Like, I'm from Oregon, and it's like there's always been like, like the art made out of like the bicycle wheel, and like I never really took that seriously. Like, I don't know, I kind of, sometimes I'm sort of dismissive of something where that's what you're in awe of, is like, this was turned into that, it's like this kind of simple transformation. But the truth of it is, like, I love free materials. I just feel like there's it opens up something else in like my ability to work with it, where I'm not worrying about like this thing being precious or valuable, or having had it fabricated, having paid someone to make it look this particular way. That just, it just makes me feel more open in working with it. I can take it apart. And so getting things for free is really like, is more like the kind of like psychological weight of it than anything else. Like, anytime I've really paid for something to like bring it into the studio, it almost like, it troubles me a little bit. Like, I'm like, I have to like mess it up to like bring it down to the level of all the other junk. But and then the chair that you, or the couch that you mentioned, Percival Lafer, just, I did not know anything about this couch. That my friend was moving, and he was like, hey, I have this really cool couch. It sent me a picture of it. And then, I bring the couch in, then I research and sort of like learn about it, because it's like right in front of you. You have to deal with the object and what it is. And a lot of these things do have really interesting histories. And for example, his father was a car manufacturer. So he really was innovative with upholstery in terms of using the auto upholstery machines, which kind of, for really fast cars, the upholstery kind of has to wrap around the driver's seat. And that's, I think, how he kind of got to these kind of like melted forms. He's Brazilian modernist, and very much worth looking up if anyone is interested. And I just kind of started taking the couch apart and like seeing what the pieces were. And I don't know, I kind of like to like tell stories about the work, because it's helpful, I think. But the foam on the right, when I stripped the leather off of it, I was like, oh my God, this foam it's covered with bugs. It's like infested with bugs. I have to get rid of it. And I started just by cutting it into 3 pieces so that I could fit it into trash bags and like take it out of the studio before I infested my whole studio. And then I looked more closely at it, and it wasn't bugs at all. It was just like the leftover, like, I don't know, fuzz from the
like shedding of the leather.
Yeah, from the leather breaking down over however old this thing was, 60 years old. And so I'd cut it into these 3 pieces, and that's the piece that you see on the right. I cut it into these perfect kind of chair-like pieces. And it wasn't, it was just a bit, it was just a good circumstance that led to, I don't know, having that piece of foam. The legs, I think it was a little bit more of like, at that point, I was kind of like, what do people like? Why do people like design, and what do they like about it? When I go into these places, like you're overhearing conversations, and they're like loving Danish modernism, and I knew I kind of wanted to like get into that space and kind of like irritate this kind of reverence that people had for these things. So I was looking for certain types of objects, and I was lucky to find this kind of, I don't even know what that was. It was like a Danish modern desk. And I also took that apart and kind of, reconfigured the pieces.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting just, you talking about your background working in this sort of like reproduction, mid-century modernism, and, being sort of appalled by the idea of creating a kind of fake of that object, but in total opposition to sort of what the ideals or the principles of mid-century modern design were. Him trying to make it like as cheaply and as efficiently, or for him, cheaply as possible. But you're still sort of interested in, perhaps as like as a result of that, why it is that modernist furniture design still, as you said, like has this kind of reverence, is identified with this
like an existential morality or something that people put onto these objects. And I don't know, there just seemed to be a lot of power in that, and a lot of like room for kind of manipulation or irritation, like you said.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't necessarily think that you're necessarily meaning to be to denigrate them as objects. It really is kind of a probing of like their limits, or a kind of pushing at um, these icons of modernism and the sort of esteem and valuation that they continue to hold. I mean, one thing I love about Muscle Chair laying down to talk is the way it almost sort of resembles Corbusier and Charlotte Perrion's lounge chair, iconic lounge chair. And of course, using Muscle Chair, I think it also alludes to the sort of dominance of the narrative of modernist design as being sort of masculine, of the number of male practitioners, which we know to be untrue. But then with this sort of parenthetical laying down to talk, it sort of summons like domestic pillow talk to some extent, which I think is like a similar to what you're doing with Maraschino Ferry, with the sort of Hoffman chair that's then tarted up a little bit. And it's yes, it's like, it's not a singular operation, and the sort of allusions that are happening through titles, through the use of materials that you don't usually find visible, like the bun feet you're using to sit in between the leather and the sort of bone-like armature. Or I mean, it's fascinating. It's interesting.
Yeah, the bun feet, I'll just speak to that. It's like that kind of, it was just kind of a simple inversion at that point. Like these bun feet are under every kind of middle price range couch or ottoman or sofa. It's just a very kind of standard furniture foot. And it just comes from taking these things apart and having the objects, and then it's like, what if they're not at the bottom of the chair, or of the thing? What if what if you kind of see them more? They're sort of elevated. And I think we'll probably get around to this, but I think there's always been something about like, I'm just interested in like the hierarchies within the kind of thinking about design, and like the hierarchies within a certain object, and then also kind of looking broadly at design, what those hierarchies are, which I think, we mentioned kind of what works to include, and it's some to actually, it's hard for me sort of to look back at a lot of these because they're all chairs, and I was just so interested in the chair at first because it had all this power. It just felt, it's like an attention getting object. It's easy to have a favorite chair, have a chair. It's like it usually kind of stands in for a person. There's a million things. It's kind of like the top of, it can stand in for an entire kind of attitude or philosophy of design. You see like a Rietveld chair, it's like that's the philosophy. And now I'm much more interested in these kind of other objects, that fall in different kind of, maybe they're not in the hierarchy at all, which I think we'll get around to. But the bun foot, for example, I love, like, you encounter this object and it's like, where is this in the hierarchy of like making furniture?
Also, it's, again, like you're using it in this way in which it's not supposed to function like that. That's not its actual function, which I think maybe let's go to the next slide, which is again this moment in which you are maybe, as you can see on the left in red eyelashes, like you are still incorporating the chair, but at this time you've like sort of refused its function. You've transformed it into a structural support for a shelf that's also maybe a table. And again, the sort of multiplicity of how it could work. The same thing on the right, you see all these like, almost like, are those Cheska chairs sort of like stacked on top of each other, but also a shelf. And what's interesting, I think, in addition to the ways that this moment in 2018-19, when you're incorporating objects, but sort of like refusing to let them perform as expected, you're also starting to bring in fabricated elements into the works, which I think is interesting because you mentioned before when, objects come into the studio that are too precious, feeling like, how do you sort of, mess them up? How do you sort of not have them be as quite as pristine?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, so I did, there's fabricated elements in the piece on the left. This kind of what they call a tambour cabinet. It's like, you're probably most familiar with like an old desk where you kind of have this roll down function. I bought a small version, I think, off of eBay. And, I've always been kind of interested in like the opening and closing of an object or cabinet or some form of storage, or even the slip covers, zipping and unzipping. So I liked the idea that that you're kind of like, it's just, I don't know, it just kind of it changes your relationship to the object, this kind of like sexy, like scroll, like opening. And so I had a few of these tambour cabinets made, and I don't know, I mean, I try honestly not to give too much instruction to my friend who makes them. I just do like a little drawing and some basic dimensions, and it's like, just make it, cheaply and however makes sense to you. So that's kind of one way that I sort of try to keep it from being too precious. I'm not against fabrication. It's just, I think there's a lot of like striving for that in art that I see, where it's like striving to like make the thing so seamless and so perfect, and it's just not what I'm interested in.
Or to get to the point where you have enough money that you can make someone else do it for you. And I think that there's a difference in terms of the way you're thinking about having something fabricated. There sort of became a point when you realize like, oh, like that part can be sort of come to me and then I can add to it, or I'm not losing anything in the sort of loss of touch and engagement, or it's just easier if somebody else does it, but it's not a sort of symbol of having gotten to a certain place in one's career to necessarily.
That is maybe part of it, I think. so yeah, it's just I'm, to be honest, I'm also not I'm not that great of like a builder per se. Like I can kind of figure it out, and a lot of the decisions that end up being details, it's really like me not knowing how to do it and kind of just figuring out how to do it my own way, which is great. But a lot of times, I don't know, it would probably take me like a month to build that thing. I don't have the like step by step kind of way of going about something that a fabricator has. Like it's impossible for me to build like a box, you know. I've tried. Um
Maybe let's go to the next slide and see what you've been more recently working on. And this sort of plays to what we were talking about before when we were thinking about the way that certain objects are valued over others. The work on the left, Melted Natural, which is also in the exhibition, as is Emotional Strategy Sconce on the right. Um, Recently you've been working with all these different sort of wooden salad bowls or chip and dip bowls, as a kind woman at a local thrift store here in Houston pointed out you purchased one. um, uh, and in your conversation again with Johanna, she says, quote, "Your salad bowls exemplify the perversity of your work. You're purposely misunderstanding their function. Your logic is that they're wooden and so it's furniture, so it makes sense to make them into furniture. But of course, that's very weird," which I also love. Um, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these works before we maybe look through some slides of the exhibition while taking some questions.
now I really feel like sometimes I'm searching for design objects that kind of um, speak to the present moment, or maybe they're like the salad bowls are really from the 70s, and there is a basic relationship to furniture because of the material, but I also love that they're sort of like something you would never have now. Like they're like the idea of like eating out of like a wooden porous material where you see all the stains. Like this just isn't a contemporary thing. This is like a thing of the past. And
Disgusting about it, like even just the like thought of cleaning or trying to clean a wooden bowl where it's still slimy no matter what you do, and the porousness of the material. Yeah.
I don't know. So there's sort of something like I also have a memory. Like I had wooden salad bowls growing up. I kind of like grew up with the residue of like the 70s and like 70s objects where everybody sort of had a craft, and like these kind of like wood carving projects are sort of a like an object memory of that are really readily accessible. Like they cost $1 or $2 on eBay, or they're like the thing in the thrift store that like nobody's looking at. So they're easy for me to kind of accumulate and, and then make accumulations out of them. And it's a little hard to see from that photo, but there's another table in the show as well that's like all these wooden objects, and they're kind of congealed with this sawdust and wood glue mixture, which is something that I use a lot in my work as a kind of way of connecting to objects, or sort of like my own weird personal joinery. But I think also we were going to get into talking about the slogan t-shirts, which, again, the kind of orbiting that same idea, like what is this, like what are these slogan t-shirts? Like are these something that we'll look back on in like 20-30 years, and they will kind of like define this moment where it's like a statement in the first person about yourself? And so yeah, the sconce on the right, it has three different slogan t-shirts. They're kind of layered, and I think of it almost like a conversation in like a crowded room where you're sort of hearing different different personalities kind of come forward. And the one underneath says, "Trust me, I'm a dog lover." So the text is kind of obscured, but as you sort of get closer to the object, you can read and read the work.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that your sort of probing of how objects and materials hold certain emotional resonances for us as well, and bring us back to very specific um, personal experiences, or cultural or social experiences, is interesting. And you know, sort of, again, there's this like disrespect of materials, but not necessarily in a um, uh, or questioning of you know, their disposability through your use. Maybe let's look through some of the installation images. I know this is from the Whitney Museum, and this is when you started to sort of first make works that were sort of doubly functioning as artworks and then also installation furniture. But let's go to the next one.
Okay.
This is from Bridget Donahue, and then maybe let's go to the next one so we can get to, yes, the exhibition at CAMH Wildlife, which I hope everyone will come and see. I know we have a few questions lined up, but maybe just briefly before we get into that, I did want to talk about, and I sort of mentioned this before when I was referencing um, muscle chair, but there's something incredibly compelling about the way both you and actually Murray as artists are using language in the titling of your works. We've talked previously, you and I, about the sort of cringeworthiness of some of Murray's titles and her emotional honesty. She really wears her heart on her sleeve sometimes. Your titles have a similar candidness, often mixed with a wry or punning humor. So for example, the large ottoman that sits right here is Silver Pitfall Ottoman, but you're also including language that hints at or indexes what an object's potential function or multiple functions might be. How do you come up with the titles for your works?
I keep a running list. I don't know. I really feel like titles. I love titling work, and I keep running lists. I feel like titles are everywhere. Then it's sort of like a coming together of the some element of maybe what I've written down and kept as a title, and like what I'm working on. Like, you know, I'm not really titling the work as I go, but usually somewhere along the process of working on it, I'm getting an idea of what I want to title it. And I tell people, like, if you're trying to title your work, like constantly writing down every title, like no matter how bad or like cheesy it is, it's amazing. It's the best thing you can do, because you just kind of never know like when like a title and an artwork are going to meet and match up. And I have plenty of titles I look back at that feel like huge mistakes, and it also makes me cringe.
Give us an example.
I can't. I try to block it out. I can't.
You don't have to.
I change the titles sometimes. I mean, I can tell you. I'm like embarrassed to tell the story, but I had this other Ottoman work, and it was for this exhibition kitchen arrangement, and I was thinking about like people who do like roosters all over the kitchen. This was a thing. My aunt had a kitchen like that. It was very like suburban 2000s thing, like a chicken theme. And I just I knew I wanted to call the Ottoman like cock Ottoman, but I just, for some reason, I was like not feeling bold enough to write it. And like the nice people at the museum were like, what's the title? And I was just like, Rooster Ottoman. And then I had to like, every time I read it, I was like, this is not the title of the work. Like, I wanted to call it Cock Ottoman. I can't believe I was such a
you felt prude.
I wanted,
or a prudishness, a sensibility that you felt that you had to sort of edit yourself.
Which was twice as bad, because then I had to go back and be like, please change the title to Cock Ottoman. And it was just humiliating personally. But now I'm very happy with the title, and every time I read it, I'm very satisfied. So
Maybe we can just scroll through a few of the images while I pose some of these questions that Jessi received. So this question is, how important are your sketches in the process of creating your work? Because I think we can all see that you have some sketches behind you. Do you consider them as precious as the work? Are your works precious?
The drawings, no, I tape them. I am in my studio. I don't tape them up to look at them. I just tape them up to keep myself from like spilling coffee on them. But no, they're not precious. I tend to like take notes on them. So half of them have like, whatever, probably have my social security number on one of them. Like, who knows what dimensions or whatever I'm working on. But I tend to draw sort of halfway through the process or somewhere in the middle when I'm sick of working on something. Or if I'm feeling lazy or tired in the studio, I'll just kind of sit where I'm sitting now. I have paper here in front of me and I'll just kind of draw. My studio is kind of long and narrow, so I get this kind of front to back thing. So I'll sort of draw things from different perspectives, and it helps, I think. Now I gave one the other day to my friend for her birthday, so it's nice to have things that are a little more portable than like a big heavy piece. And is the work precious? No, it is now, some of it, because I don't own it, which was always an interesting experience, encountering your work when you no longer own it and you can't touch it. But in the studio, no, I'm setting my drill on the thing I'm working on while I'm working on the other thing. And
Yeah, you'll just nail something right into the wall.
Yeah, that's typically, because it's usually just me in here. I'm lucky to have some really wonderful people help me over the years, but for the most part, it's just me. So I need to be able to like hold something up with one hand and I'll just drill straight through it to hold it into the wall. And I like all that kind of like studio residue. So I hope that.
We have another question. In the beginning of the discussion, you spoke about your disrespect for the faux luxury design objects you first began working with. Yet your work acknowledges these design hierarchies of good and bad taste. How do you decide on the objects you use when you can't get them for free or have them fabricated? And what is your personal hierarchy? Is there any style of furniture design that is off limits?
That's a really interesting question. Is anything off limits? I hate to admit it, but I guess I have like one or two things that like I have in my apartment that I really love to look at, and so I don't take them apart. But I don't know that I wouldn't ever, maybe I'll be just over them in 5 or 10 years, and then I'll take them apart or use them in some way. But and I guess that's kind of just what I'm into now. Like the thing I'm thinking of is I have this chair by this guy Dorich Sipek, who's really amazing. I can maybe type it in the chat since it's a weird name. But I don't know. I'm obsessed with him. And so if I ever found something by him, it would be hard for me in this moment to like use it, almost because I'm so like
because you love it too much. That's something that only the objects you love too much you wouldn't use.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah,
or at least design wise, I'd say.
Yeah, maybe. But there's very few things that I feel that way about. I feel that way. What was the first part of the question? About what was the first part of it? I forgot. Long question.
Yeah, there were different parts about hierarchies between good and bad taste.
Oh yeah, how do I?
Which I think is, part of it is I think that you're really pushing at those hierarchies or like showing that they exist, and I don't necessarily think that you follow suit. I don't know that you necessarily feel that that you or you prescribe to those hierarchies. You're sort of pointing them out as constructed, and again, like this sort of idea of the hierarchy between the fine arts and design to some extent, which I think your work really pulls apart. Sorry to answer that for you.
No, it's fine. You did, yeah, you did a better job than I will. I mean, I think I'm trying to think of, I feel like maybe I'm sort of explaining what I mean by hierarchy. Like, of course there is like, sometimes I'm interested in like the ottoman because it's like the chair's like little friend who like he drags, or like he's not invited to the party but he came or something. And I like the kind of like playing with that idea, even just as not even as like finished content in the work, but just for me, you have to have like things that you get excited about that are like generative for you. And so however you kind of like carve those out, and hierarchy is just something that I'm kind of tuned into. Like even the back, I love the idea of the back of the cabinet. And I do sort of have these like little anecdotes about these things, where I like the idea that you would maybe have a cabinet like pushed up against the wall, and then you would kind of like, at some point it like comes off of the wall and you like see the back of it, and there's often on the back of a cabinet there's a lot of information about, you just see where the materials come together, you actually see what the cabinet's made out of. There's sometimes markings or stickers that tell you where it's from or what it is. And so I like those kinds of hierarchies too, just playing with that idea, painting something on the back of the cabinet to kind of like draw attention to this idea that a sculpture has no back, but the cabinet has a back. And sometimes I think I choose things based on something I've already had. For example, like I made 3 tables for the back of Bridget's, and if I could have chosen, I would have had 3 versions of this table that I just got lucky and found one time. But instead I sort of started looking for things that were similar to that. So if I don't have like exactly what I want, I'll sort of start looking for something similar. And usually because it's kind of, I like the idea of a copy or a replica standing in for the original as well. To me, I've said this many times, but I like the idea that I'm interested in the idea that even if you don't know the Barcelona chair, even if you don't know the history of that chair, you know it to some extent. You know it as the chair in the Chase Bank lobby. Like you've encountered this object.
Corporatization, of mid-century design.
And there's infinite examples of that, like with Maraschino Ferry, like it's a bent wood thing, it's the Thonet thing, it's a catering chair, or it's this very important piece of design history, depending on like how you're looking at it and what you're sort of bringing to it or interested in about it. So I prefer the like cheap copy because it kind of teases at that second layer of information around these objects.
Yeah, so maybe we'll have time for one more question. And it's from Ingrid Schaffner, and she says, Jessi, we can't wait for you to be at Chinati. What sparks your connection to Elizabeth Murray, which is, oh God, a whole large part of this exhibition that we didn't get to talk because I really wanted to focus on your work. But maybe you could give.
Yeah. I can.
I mean, I'm happy to.
Rebecca could go on and on. I mean, I'll say like, I was lucky to encounter her work when I moved to New York. We stopped in Chicago, and I saw that's where I saw the first one at the museum at the Art Institute. And there's sort of the easiest kind of characteristic of them for me to focus on, and like I'm pretty like directly influenced by it, is just the way that they sort of peel off of the wall. I've said like they look like they're peeling like roadkill, like kind of curling at the edges like roadkill. But I just like impressed by their like insistence on taking up space. Like, I think there really is an economy to painting where it's like easy to store, it's flat on the wall, it's out of the way, it looks good above the couch, like it doesn't stick out 6 feet and like twist into a spiral and like have a scary hole in the middle of it, mostly. And I really like the boldness of those decisions within her work, and it's just I don't know, it's something that I've really tried to like, emulate or be be inspired by, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just say that, when I first approached you about this exhibition, I didn't know that you necessarily were looking at or thinking about Murray. For me, and I guess I probably should have given this backstory at the beginning, though I think we really wanted again to focus on your work. The origin of the exhibition is that I had a really difficult time with Elizabeth Murray's work for a while. It was sort of the sincerity was kind of abrasive. The work was to some extent crude and disorienting in its scale, in its cartoonishness, and the frequency with which it depicted domestic life or the body. And so I'd struggled with it for a while, though I thought about it often. And then I can't remember if it's 2017 or 18, Jessi and I had our first studio visit shortly after I'd seen Murray's 80s show at Pace. And I remember going into Jessi's studio, and it was hard to determine what was a chair to sit on and what was an artwork in the process of being made. And, in a similar manner, Jessi's works were to some extent crude, but at the same time had these sort of decorative or ornamental or Baroque flourishes, and were very much involved in the sort of fragmentation of the body. And I had this kind of aha moment in which I was like, oh my God, I get Murray. I get the way that both Jessi and Murray are looking at the body in the home and binding the body in the home as these sites of both pleasure and repulsion, as these sites that could at any moment collapse and fall to pieces to some extent. So that was at least for me the origin of the exhibition. We are. Oh, do you want to go ahead and say something?
I want to say one last thing is for them, however many times I looked at it, I never saw the furniture objects in her work until we started working on this show. So many of them are like a top-down view of a table.
Aerial view, yeah.
Yeah, an aerial view. I don't know, and I just never saw those forms in it. And there's really just there's crazy things like the legs like twisting around, like they are oftentimes like views of these domestic objects. And it took me a long time to see that, and that's another quality of her work that I really like, which is like over time. I think who was her art dealer? That
Paula Cooper.
Paula Cooper. I had read that Paula Cooper said about her, like, the longer you live with the work, or like the longer you're around it, the more you see. And I think sometimes it's like it's helpful for me to kind of hone in on like what are the qualities you want your work to embody, and that just seemed like that's like one of the best things that anyone could say about your work, that it continues to like unfold in front of you. Like,
yeah, that the images are always multiple, and even if, like you, she's cueing you to certain aspects through titling, through language, that the more time you spend with them, the more they unfold in front of you, as you said. And I think that's just to add to that, and while answering maybe the last question, that was really why we also, it was important to us that there were works of yours that also functioned as exhibition furniture, that offered time and space, this sort of prolonged engagement, and that your work could function as a lens or a platform from which we might begin to reconsider Murray's works, and to really think about the relationship between both of your works, while also acknowledging that they were made during, within very specific historical contexts, but that, sitting and having time and space to let things unfold before you would create a context in which we could show the contemporaneity of Murray's work and also place yours within a historical context.